In that time was born in Eldamar, in the house of the king in Tirion, upon the crown of Tuna, the eldest of the sons of Finwë, and the most beloved. Curufinwë was his name, but by his mother he was called Fëanor, spirit of fire, and thus he is remembered in all the tales of the Noldor. Míriel was the name of his mother, who was called Serinda, because of her surpassing skill in weaving and needlework, for her hands were more skilled to fineness than any hands even among the Noldor. The love of Finwë and Míriel was great and glad, for it began in the blessed realm in the days of bliss. But in the bearing of her son, Míriel was consumed in spirit and body, and after his birth she yearned for release from the labor of living. And when she had named him, she said to Finwë, "Never again shall I bear child, for strength that would have nourished the life of many has gone forth into Fëanor." Then Finwë was grieved, for the Noldor were in the youth of their days, and he desired to bring forth many children into the bliss of Aman. And he said, "Surely there is healing in Aman. Here all weariness can find rest." But when Míriel languished still, Finwë sought the counsel of Manwë, and Manwë delivered her to the care of Irmo in Lórien. At their parting, for a little while as he thought, Finwë was sad, for it seemed an unhappy chance that the mother should depart and miss the beginning at least of the childhood days of her son. "It is indeed unhappy," said Míriel, "and I would weep if I were not so weary. But hold me blameless in this and in all that may come after." She went then to the gardens of Lórien and lay down to sleep, but though she seemed to sleep, her spirit indeed departed from her body, and passed in silence to the halls of Mandos. The maidens of Esta tended the body of Míriel, and it remained unwithered, but she did not return. Then Finwë lived in sorrow, and he went often to the gardens of Lórien, and sitting beneath the silver willows beside the body of his wife, he called her by her names. But it was unavailing, and alone in all the blessed realm he was deprived of joy. After a while he went to Lórien no more. All his love he gave thereafter to his son, and Fëanor grew swiftly, as if a secret fire were kindled within him. He was tall and fair of face and masterful, his eyes piercingly bright and his hair raven dark. In the pursuit of all his purposes eager and steadfast, few ever changed his courses by counsel and none by force. He became of all the Noldor, then or after, the most subtle in mind and the most skilled in hand. In his youth, bettering the work of Rúmul, he devised those letters which bear his name, and which the Eldar used ever after. And he it was who, first of the Noldor, discovered how gems greater and brighter than those of the earth might be made with skill. The first gems that Fëanor made were white and colorless, but being set under starlight they would blaze with blue and silver fires brighter than Helluin, and other crystals he made also, wherein things far away could be seen small but clear, as with the eyes of the eagles of Manwë. Seldom were the hands and mind of Fëanor at rest. While still in his early youth he wedded Nerdanel, the daughter of a great smith named Matan, and among those of the Noldor most dear to Aula. And of Matan he learned much of the making of things in metal and in stone. Nerdanel also was firm of will, but more patient than Fëanor, desiring to understand minds rather than to master them. And at first she restrained him when the fire of his heart grew too hot, but his later deeds grieved her, and they became estranged. 7 sons she bore to Fëanor. Her mood she bequeathed in part to some of them, but not to all. Now it came to pass that Finwë took as his second wife Indis the fair. She was a Vanya, close kin of Ingwë the High King, golden-haired and tall, and in all ways unlike Míriel. Finwë loved her greatly and was glad again, but the shadow of Míriel did not depart from the house of Finwë, nor from his heart, and of all whom he loved, Fëanor had ever the chief share of his thought. The wedding of his father was not pleasing to Fëanor, and he had no great love for Indis, nor for Fingolfin and Finarfin, his sons. He lived apart from them, exploring the land of Aman, or busying himself with the knowledge and the crafts in which he delighted. In those unhappy things which later came to pass, in which Fëanor was the leader, many saw the effect of this breach within the house of Finwë, judging that if Finwë had endured his loss and been content with the fathering of his mighty son, the courses of Fëanor would have been otherwise, and great evil might have been prevented. For the sorrow and the strife in the house of Finwë is graven in the memory of the Noldoran elves. But the children of Indus were great and glorious, and their children also. And if they had not lived, the history of the Eldar would have been diminished. Welcome, I'm Professor Rachel Fulton Brown, and this is The Forge of Tolkien. Did you get all of it? We're now getting deep into the actual story of the elves, having talked about the awakening of the elves, what are elves, these Silmarils that Fëanor is going to end up making, and with our little detour on dragons, of course, which, well, my dog is still here, and hopefully he will continue to sleep peacefully. Was it necessary for Míriel to die? Was it necessary for Finwë to remarry? Well, for the story, it seems so, yes. But interestingly, after the Silmarillion, after he sort of figures out the Silmarillion, Tolkien started having some second thoughts, and particularly he started worrying about whether or not it was appropriate for Finwë to remarry, given that, I mean, interestingly, a good part of the narrative is driven by the fact that Fëanor doesn't like his half siblings. Thus, and this is the point of this episode, is one to sort of let you be a little bit more familiar with the intricacies of this family feud, but also, and more importantly, to talk about the ways in which Tolkien's own storytelling created theological problems for him that he then bent over backwards in the background of his sort of wrangling with his own story world to answer. These are not things that, interestingly, well, because the Silmarillion is not published during his lifetime, nobody's writing to him and saying, well, exactly what happened with Míriel and Finwë, and I thought you were Roman Catholic and people just got married for life, and how dare you let Finwë remarry when Míriel is well, but she's dead, right? Her spirit has left her body. And why? I mean, if you're great, if what you've advised your son Michael in that letter on marriage that we talked about, that it's important for women to want children, and here Míriel gives birth to a child and she dies outright, or she just gets so weary that okay. So what's interesting in this episode is it occasioned, I mean, is sort of like arcane and embedded in family lore as it is, it occasioned some of Tolkien's most sort of wrenching theological meditations in later life, because he was trying to figure out, well, what kind of relationship do the elves have with their bodies and souls. I have now started this episode 3 times, and I'm going to keep going because I do want to wrestle this out. And it's I think the theme of this episode is how theology arises out of story. There are various layers of what I'm going to need to talk about to make sense of that. Specifically, so how does the logic of the story hold? I'm talking to you about a very particular sort of something that Tolkien wrote later in life, and Christopher publishes it in Morgoth's Ring in the later Silmarillion, but it's entitled grandly of the laws and customs among the Eldar pertaining to to marriage and other matters related thereto, together with the statute of Finwë and Míriel and the debate of the Valar at its making. That, again, this is, curiously enough, of all of the incidents that Tolkien created for himself in the Silmarillion, the one that he seemed to have had to return to a number of times, never satisfied himself. There's drafts, there's starts and stops, and one of the drafts of what we're looking at literally stops in the middle of a sentence, right? There's he's talking about the severing of the marriage and whether trying to figure out whether it's appropriate for Finwë to remarry after Míriel has done whatever she has done, and we're going to figure that out. And we just end up with, if then marriage is not ended while the dead are in the halls of waiting in hope or purpose to return, but is only in abeyance, how then shall it be ended when the Fëa, what's that, is again in the land of the living? But herein there is indeed a difficulty that reveals to us that death is a thing unnatural. It may be amended, but it cannot, while Arda lasts, be wholly undone or made as if it had not been. What shall come to pass as the Eldar grow older cannot be wholly foreseen, but perceiving their nature as we do now, we hold that the love of the there is, as it were, enfolded in the story fact that Tolkien wanted to have Fëanor as this character who was literally the spirit of fire, right? That's his name. His mother calls him Fëanor, which I'm also cathected in this episode because I don't know how to say the names. According to Tolkien's pronunciation guide, E's are pronounced as in were, so I'm trying to say Finwë, Manwë, Olme, Fëanor. I just want it to be Fëanor. I want it to be fire. I want it to be this power. So Tolkien is creating for himself in his story world the maker of all things, right? He's got Fëanor is so powerful that he basically sucks all the energy out of his mother when she is giving birth to him. But then Tolkien has created this problem for himself because he's got this mother who is so wearied, she's not rejoicing in the birth of her child. She's just overcome with the strength of this son that she's given birth to, that she goes and lies down on a tree. And well, does she die? He has it in the version of the story that Christopher published in the Silmarillion, because there are other versions always, right? That her spirit indeed departed from her body, but her body doesn't decay, right? Her body is left in the gardens, the maidens of Esta tending it, and she does not return, and this leaves Finwë in this rather complicated situation because he wants more children, and Míriel has basically just drifted off, right? And because her body's still incorrupt, as it were, but her spirit has gone off to this halls of Mandos, whatever that is. And although it's not explained in the Silmarillion itself, Finwë takes a second wife. Well, you can see that if Tolkien's wrestling with it in his note-taking and creating this whatever, it's a document. Christopher even says it's not really clear to whom this laws and customs among the Eldar is actually addressed, or by whom. There's a thing that says it's Elfwin's preamble, which suggests it's another of these accounts of the time traveler man, or the man who has had some contact with the elves and explaining the problems to a human audience. But it's clear that it's presented. It's not of one of the Eldar, but of a man. But it's not really clear exactly where in the framework of sort of ethnography this particular study is meant to fall. And yet it's really worth studying because it's one of the places where, one, Tolkien is going to say some more about what he thinks about the relations between the sexes, which we all care about studying. What he thinks about marriage and his sort of idealization of it, because as we've talked about, he's using the elves to think about his own theological questions and his own grappling with his real life, right? That he, as Baron, marries Lúthien, and that raises her in his estimation to this character in his legendarium. But also, as he told Michael, it's like, your mother and I had difficulties in our youth and growing up with you and having children, that he's allowing Míriel to say, that was too much for me, I need to go lie down. Is a very interesting little moment, right? It's like you always wonder about and this is obviously, well, not pre-contraception, but certainly pre the pill, and it's within a Catholic understanding. Well, marriage is for the begetting of children, and if you are having, children annually, I mean, Tolkien and Edith only have 4 children, but the 3 boys come fairly close together, and then there's a pause, and then Priscilla is born. To whom is Tolkien writing? Is this to himself? Is this, out of longing to Edith to say, I'm sorry I didn't know what it took out of you to give birth to our children? Is it, I so wish we could have had more? What exactly is Tolkien wrestling with in this very curious document? Well, it sets up, and I think maybe now I've explained my own fascination with it sufficiently. One of the most important things is it sets up the context in the backstory for Arwen and Aragorn's relationship, and specifically sort of what it meant for Aragorn to, propose marriage to Arwen, whether that was within the bounds of the Elvish Eldar's customs. Also, what, sort of how you think about the fact that the Eldar live so long in all of the stories, and yet they don't keep having children, right? The most, the children are there. Say Arwen is born to Elrond in, centuries ago, and he doesn't have like hundreds and thousands of children. If you say the elves live so long, why don't they continue to have children indefinitely, right? They seem to have fairly small families. In fact, I mean, it's remarkable that Nerdanel bore 7 sons to Fëanor. Even when Finwë remarries with Indus, he and Indus don't have, children indefinitely, right? So he wanted more children. I realized I forgot to look up exactly how many they have. I will now look it up, which is, you guys can always embarrass me with details. So Míriel has Fëanor, and he has 7 sons, right? But Finwë marries Indus, and she has only two more sons. In fact, Fingolfin and Finarfin, and therefore the elves don't have enormous families, right? They have human-sized families, as it were. And Tolkien is also having to figure out what that means. It's one of those things that makes it easier to keep track of the characters, which is hard enough as it is, even when you're having to look in the back of the book for the genealogies. But Tolkien then, of course, being Tolkien, also needed to make it meaningful that the elves do get married. They are expected to stay married to the same spouse indefinitely throughout the existence of the world. I mean, they're immortal in the sense that they live as long as Arda exists. So they are, but they're not in fact immortal, because they can die, right? So death comes to them. He's created all sorts of theological and anthropological problems for himself in this, and I think that's what he's doing with this wrestling of the laws and customs. But he's also obviously wrestling with his own expectations about what marriage means, and I think in this, to go along with the letter 43, when he talks about marriage in the laws and customs of the Eldar, he is playing with what his ideal would be, but then also recognizing that his ideal has some problems of its own. So, for example, he starts with the custom that the Eldar have of getting married, right? And he says they wedded for the most part in their youth, and soon after their 50th year, given that they live thousands of years potentially, or even hundreds if they get caught up in the war with Morgoth. They're still living hundreds of years, but they get married fairly young. They had few children, but these were very dear to them. Now that you should be sort of being curious now. It's like, why do they have so few? Their families or houses were held together by a love and a deep feeling for kinship in mind and body, and the children needed little governing or teaching. Lol. I mean, when I was making my notes for this episode, it's like lol, lol, lol. It's like he's sort of the fantasy version of, yes, their children, My puppy needs more teaching than Elvish children. Right? There were seldom more than 4 children, so it's remarkable that Fëanor has 7 sons in any house, and the number grew less as ages passed, which is also interesting, right? It's like the older families of the elves have more children than the more recent ones, right? But even in days of old, while the Eldar were still few and eager to increase their kind, Fëanor was renowned as the father of 7 sons, and histories record none that surpassed him. That he's so full of fire that not only does he rewrite the alphabet and make fancy gemstones, he has more children than anybody else, right? So there's this, his fire is both of his artificing, right? His making of beautiful things, but it's also in fathering children. The Eldar wedded once only in life, for love or at least by free will upon either part. Now that's very important. He says, okay, they get married by choice, and that, you know, in the Aragorn and Arwen story becomes incredibly important because, of course, she has to choose Aragorn. Her father doesn't necessarily like it. He says, you know, puts the condition on only if, you know, you're marrying the King of Gondor will I let you do that. But what Tolkien makes sure is that his characters marry for love, and out of each of the pair actually willingly choosing, and they all get married, right? He makes sure to say that, right? Marriage, save for rare ill chances or strange fates, was the natural course of life for y'all, the Eldar. It took place in this way. Those who would afterwards become wedded might choose one another early in youth, even as children. And indeed, this happened often in days of peace. Now that's interesting, of course, because Tolkien and Ronald and Edith fell in love when they were technically, I mean, they're underage, right? They're adolescents, but before Tolkien was free of his guardian. So he's saying, you know, the ideal is they fall in love in blissful days, and might decide who they're going to marry even as children. But unless they desired soon to be married and were of fitting age, the betrothal awaited the judgment of the parents of either party. Okay, so they have to get their parents' approval, but they can make the choice when they're children. There's a betrothal announcement. They exchange silver rings, and then when they are married, they exchange gold rings. But the betrothed gave silver rings to one another. According to the laws of the Eldar, this betrothal was bound to stand for 1 year at least, and it often stood for longer. During this time, it could be revoked by a public return of the rings. The rings would then be molten and not again used for a betrothal. Such was the law, but the right of revoking was seldom used, for the Eldar do not err lightly in such a choice. So they make the promise to be betrothed, and they could go back on it, but it didn't happen. Interestingly, he says, they're not easily deceived by their own kind, and their spirits being masters of their bodies. They are seldom swayed by the desires of the body alone, but are by nature continent and steadfast. This is so idealized, right? He's saying they know who they're going to marry when they're growing up. Typically, if they're growing up in happy times, they ask their parents for permission. They exchange rings, silver rings, to promise themselves to each other, and the betrothal typically lasts a year. It could last longer. Very rarely did they ever go back on this promising. And by the way, they were governed by their minds, not by their bodies, or they're governed by their spirits. Nonetheless, among the Eldar, not everybody gets married, and love was not always returned, and more than one might desire one another for a spouse. So it's not perfect. We're going to say it's not perfect, but it mostly was, which is, Tolkien, as usual, sort of creating these ideals and then backpedaling on them because, well, why, right? Why isn't it simply blissful? Now, they go after the betrothal, they get married, there's a feast shared by the two houses. They say, at the end of the feast, the betrothed stood forth, and the mother of the bride and the father of the bridegroom joined the hands of the pair and blessed them. For this blessing there was a solemn form, but no mortal has heard it. So we don't get the actual liturgy, which is interesting, but there's a blessing with the mother and the father. Though the Eldar say that Varda was named in witness by the mother and Manwë by the father, and moreover that the name of Eru was spoken, as was seldom done at any other time. So it's the marriage is one of the few times that they actually speak the name of the creator, and perhaps name the other beings, the Valar, making it, you know, as close as Tolkien gets to having some kind of actual ritual, but he never wrote one out, right? So he's being coy there. The betrothed then received back from the other their silver rings and treasured them, but then they gave in exchange slender rings of gold, which were worn on the index finger of the right hand. So for some reason here. Among the Noldor also it was a custom that the bride's mother should give to the bridegroom a jewel upon a chain or a collar, and the bridegroom's father should give a light gift to the bride. These gifts were sometimes given before the feast. And this is, he explains parenthetically, the gift that Galadriel gives to Aragorn is following on this, because Galadriel is standing in for Arwen's mother. But these ceremonies, okay, so we've had, it's all by choice. There's betrothal, there's a public recognition of the betrothal, the families are involved. Tolkien is playing off of a lot of tradition here, and you'd say, okay, but he said that the spirit is the one making the choice, and that's very important. However, and this is interesting where he's, you know, showing his Catholicism, right? But these ceremonies were not rites necessary to marriage. Interestingly, he doesn't make the I do the center of it being the marriage, which in, you know, proper canonical form in the long medieval tradition, and of course into the present, which is the way we play off consent as being, you know, really the thing that makes marriage, the I do. He says, one, we don't know what the solemn form of the marriage was, so I'm not going to give you the words for it, and very significantly says the rites were not the thing that was necessary. They were only a gracious mode by which the love of the parents was manifested, and the union was recognized, which would join not only the betrothed but their two houses together. So Elvish marriage is, although it's chosen by the individuals, it's about the families bonding, but they're not married yet. What makes the marriage? Sex. It was the act of bodily union that achieved marriage, and after which the indissoluble bond was complete. Now that is very interesting. He said, it, on the one hand, they are bound because of their choice, and their spirits are making the choices, not their lust, right? That's, you know, the coy way he's saying it's they're masters of their own bodies and seldom swayed by the desires of the body alone. So I think if you're looking at Finwë and Míriel and their love for each other, it's expressed physically. It has to be expressed physically in the way in which Tolkien is setting this. I'm not sure what to call it. It's a sacramental theory, but it's not really a sacrament because there's no grace involved in it. It's like they're not being saved by this marriage, but he's trying to understand what makes the, well, he said it's law and customs. And as I've said, that this is the only thing that this wrestling with what marriage means is going to carry on into the next text we'll talk about next time. It's the long promised Athrabad, Finrod at Anrith, when they're, you know, going to debate this more, because Anrith is in love with an elf and doesn't feel like that she's frustrated with him, and Finrod is trying to explain why his brother can't marry her, blah 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 blah. The Tolkien wrestled a lot with this particular question, and he set it up for himself in a very challenging way, because he's saying these spirits make the choice, but it's really only when their bodies join that the marriage happens. In happy days and times of peace, it was held ungracious and contemptuous of kin to forego the ceremonies, but it was at all times lawful for any of the Eldar, both being unwed, to marry thus of free consent one to another without ceremony or witness, save blessings exchanged and the naming of the name, which is very interesting. You know, so they name Eru, blessings exchanged, and the union so joined was alike indissoluble. In days of old, in times of trouble and flight and exile and wandering, such marriages were often made. The point is having sex, and promising each other to each other and naming the name, and but to marry free consent one to another without ceremonial witness, save that they do it in Eru's name. Now that's super fascinating. And then they start having children, because the whole point, as Tolkien set this up, is to have children, right? That they, not all the Noldor get to marry, and it's a cause of sadness when they don't, but the point of it all is to have children, right? So when Finwë is distressed that Míriel is left, he's he misses her, but what he really wants was more sons, and so he goes on to his second marriage, and therefore there's something essential to being an elf in having children, right? And yet remember that they only do this when they're younger, right? They only have children when they're younger, and then when they grow up, although they take great joy in their children, they go on to do other things. So why, right? What is it? And this is Tolkien's wrestling out why he can, in his own understanding, say Míriel was consumed in, all of her strength was consumed in giving birth to Fëanor, and that was it, right? That she said, strength that would have nourished the life of many has gone forth into Fëanor. It's like he's able to have 7 children by his wife, but in making him, his mother expended all of this energy. Well, as Tolkien sets himself this question, he said, it might be thought that since the Eldar do not, as men deem, grow old in body, they may bring forth children at any time in the ages of their lives. But this is not so. For the Eldar do indeed grow older, even if slowly. The limit of their lives is the life of Arda, which though long beyond the reckoning of men is not endless, and ages also. So that they age with Arda, and therefore only, but they age with Arda, so it's not in fact that they don't age, but they just, as human beings see it, as men see it, we can't tell it. But as the weight of the years with all their changes of desire and thought gathers upon the spirit of the Eldar, so do the impulses and moods of their bodies change. This the Eldar mean when they speak of their spirits consuming them, and they say that ere Arda ends, all the Eldalia on earth will become as spirits invisible to mortal eyes, unless they will be to be seen by some among men, into whose minds they may enter directly. Well, that's darn odd, right? It's saying elves eventually basically become ghosts, spirits. Now, if you remember when I talked back several episodes ago about the kind of lore that Tolkien is playing off of from medieval Europe, and the complexity of identifying what elves are in the first place, right? Lewis talks about them as the long-lived, the Longivy, and says some of them were believed to be the spirits of the dead. It really is, yet again, as if Tolkien's trying to have like everything, right? He's trying to make sense of them in the various story forms that they appear, so that they, entice away men, and time passes differently for them, and they're considered, terrifying and dangerous and so forth. But he's also trying to incorporate this idea that somehow they eventually become their bodies just like fade, right? And what if they stay in Middle Earth, if they stay in the lands of the mortal, they will become basically ghosts, right? They'll become just spirits. There's a footnote here, now I'm curious what it's about. It's editing. So they talk about, as the Eldar say, the begetting and still more in the bearing of children, greater share and strength of their being in mind and body goes forth than in the making of mortal children. For these reasons it came to pass that the Eldar brought forth few children, and also that the time of their generation was in their youth or earlier life, and less strange and hard fates befell them. But whatever age they married, their children were born within a short space of years after their wedding, although it might seem long to human beings, but for the Eldar, it's quite soon after they get married. With regard to the generation, the power and the will are not among the Eldar distinguishable. Doubtless they would retain for many ages the power of generation, if the will and desire were not satisfied, but with the exercise of the power, the desire soon ceases, and the mind turns to other things. The union of love is indeed to them great delight and joy, and the days of the children, as they call them, remain in their memory as the most merry in life. But they have many other powers of body and mind, which their nature urges them to fulfill. Thus, although the wedded remain so forever, they do not necessarily dwell or house together at all times, for without considering the chances and separations of evil days, wife and husband, albeit united, remain persons individual, having each gifts of mind and body that differ. Yet it would seem to any of the Eldar a grievous thing if a wedded pair were sundered during the bearing of a child, or while the first years of its childhood lasted, for which reason the Eldar would beget children only in days of happiness and peace, if they could. Again, that's all very interesting, right? So he set it up for himself saying, having children is the thing that gives them the greatest joy, but once they've done it, they want to move on and do other stuff. They get married out of choice and love, but the families recognize the marriages. Having gotten married out of love, they have children as soon as they possibly can. I mean, Elvish children apparently take a year in the womb. But again, when they're done, they go off and do other things. And particularly says the husband and wife remain persons individual, having each gifts of mind and body that differ. I do challenge you to consider whether Tolkien is always is Tolkien being sexist here? Well, the next passage is one of the more interesting ones, because he's talking about the men and women, the Neri and the Nissi of the Eldar, and saying how in all such things their other interests, right, not concerned with the bringing forth of children, the Neri and the Nissi, that is the men and the women of the Eldar, are equal. Unless it be in this, as they themselves say, that for the Nissi, the making of things new is for the most part shown in the forming of their children, that's the women, and the invention and change is otherwise mostly brought about by the Neri. There are, however, no matters which among the Eldar only a Ner can think or do, or others which only a Nis is concerned. There are indeed some differences between the natural inclinations of Neri and Nissi, and other differences that have been established by custom, varying in place and time, and in the several races of the Eldar. For instance, the arts of healing, and all that touches on the care of the body, are among the Eldar most practiced by the Nissi, whereas it was the elven men who bore arms at need. And the Eldar deemed that the dealing of death, even when lawful or under necessity, diminished the power of healing, and the virtue of the Nissi in this matter was due rather to their abstaining from hunting or war than any special power that went with their womanhood. Indeed, in dire straits or desperate defense, the Nissi fought valiantly, and there was less difference in strength and speed between elven men and elven women than had not born child than is seen among mortals. I'm going to come back to all of this. On the other hand, many elven men were great healers and skilled in the lore of living bodies, so such men abstained from hunting and went not to war until the last need. As for other matters, we may speak of the customs of the Noldor. Among the Noldor, it may be seen the making of bread is done mostly by women, and the making of the limbus is by ancient law reserved to them. Yet cooking and preparing of other food is generally a task and pleasure of men. The Nissi are more often skilled in tending of fields and gardens, and playing upon instruments of music, and in spinning, weaving, fashioning, and adornment of all threads and cloths, and in matters of lore they love most the histories of the Eldar and the houses of the Noldor. In all matters of kinship and descent are held by them in memory. But the Neri are more skilled as smiths and wrights, as carvers of wood and stone, and as jewelers. It is they, for the most part, who compose musics and make the instruments, or devise new ones. They are the chief poets and students of languages and inventors of words. Many of them delight in forestry and the lore of the wild, seeking the friendship of all things that grow or live there in freedom. But all these things and other matters of labor and play, or of deeper knowledge concerning the being and the life of the world, may at different times be pursued by any among the Noldor, be they Neri or Nissi. Well, for goodness sake, right? So one of the things I hope you were wondering about Míriel, and specifically that it said that she is known as Serinda because of her surpassing skill in weaving and needlework, which traditionally among human beings has been a craft of women. And her son Fëanor, she gives forth this nourishing, that the energy, the fire that he takes. He becomes very skilled in languages and metalwork and smithing and so forth. So it would seem to be in this great story of making that there's a sharp sex division. And yet, but then Tolkien, as usual, is saying, well, yes, no, right? So that on the one hand, Neri and Nissi, the men and women among the Eldar, can all be skilled in everything, and particularly, well, there's less difference between them as warriors, right? That's hopefully should surprise you. The elven men, there's less difference in strength and speed between elven men and elven women that had not borne child than is seen among mortals. So something, and he's imagining Míriel's giving birth depletes her energy, and that the giving birth of children for the Nissi, it's the thing they delight most in, and it takes energy and nourishing to make the children. But if they're virgins, because if you have sex, you're going to have the children. If they're virgins, they're, I guess, Diana-like, right? They're great huntresses and skilled warriors. Actually, so, maybe Peter Jackson was completely off in The Hobbit when he gave Legolas that companion. That it's not nonsensical in Tolkien's imagination to have these hunting and battling elf women. Likewise, he flips it over, saying, well, the Nissi tend to give themselves to healing, and in his Valar, who take on the raiment of masculine and feminine, the healing characters tend to be the feminine characters, and the warriors and the hunters tend to be the masculine characters. But he's saying, no, it's in fact going to war that diminishes the power of healing, not the fact that they're male or female. Likewise, he can say, well, the women tended to make the limbus, the bread, the way bread, which is an interesting thing, because of course everybody knows that the way bread is actually like the Eucharist. We'll get to that. And indeed, in medieval Christian practice, it was often women making the bread for the Eucharist. Tolkien gives that activity to the Neri, but he says, he gives it to the Nissi, but he says the Neri like cooking too, and they're really good at it. So it's so interesting. He's wanting to say the elf men and the elf women have particular likes and have particular skills, because he's very interested in this relationship between the incarnation and skill of craft. But he doesn't want to make anything that they do dependent on there being men and women, except of course in the begetting of children. So it's like he got tangled up. I call this episode The Making of Fëanor, and you realize the making of children for Tolkien is this great mystery, right? Everything goes into it, and then he doesn't know which way to go in saying, well, the men and the women are or aren't more involved in it. Why? What is up here? Well, one of the things that this, of course, creates, this huge problem this creates for Tolkien in his thinking, is the relationship between the spirit and the body in the first place, which is where he set up the problem for Míriel, that her body has remained incorrupt. She's sort of asleep under a tree. It's hard not to imagine like Sleeping Beauty in her glass coffin, which, if you realize, is very much an image of again, in medieval Christianity, of a holy body, a saint, right? The incorrupt. There are individuals in the Christian tradition, and I'm certain Tolkien would have been thinking about these, whose bodies are kept as as sleeping, right? Francis and Clare, for example, at Assisi, Mary Vagreda, whose work I've studied a lot. Her body is kept. And they're shown in these sort of glass coffins. It's never said that Míriel was put in a box, which I think is fair, right? She's just under the tree, and Finwë goes and mourns, misses her, and there's sorrow, and there's this, he's the only one in the Blessed Realm who feels this sorrow. And one of the things I was thinking when I was taking this notes as well, it's like Tolkien is purposefully setting things up so, nothing's ever great, right? A death and the severance of Fëanor. Like, what's death? It must be understood that what has yet been said concerning Eldar and marriage refers to its right course in nature in a world unmarred, or to the manners of those uncorrupted by the shadow and to days of peace and order. So he said, thus far what I've given you is the peace, what you get during days of peace. But nothing has been said utterly avoids the shadow upon Arda, or is wholly unmarred, so as to proceed unhindered upon its right courses. Now, there's a story reality that bliss is boring. Wait, is it? Narratively, it's really challenging just to tell a story about everything going well. Theologically, and you realize this is where we get in this kind of original sin problem, or whatever, right? Why don't they just stay in the garden? You realize that this is what Tolkien is setting up for us, that this real problem. When does the fall happen in the story of the Eldar? One choice is right now, when Míriel can't stick around and stay with her husband and have more children, that she's just so weary. Well, why? And why is this? It's like okay, I'm almost convinced now, talking to you, that Tolkien doesn't understand what it is that he's wrestling with. He just knows that there's something that he really needs to understand, and he's created this story problem for all of the. We work through Melkor and everything, so the fall of the Ainur is behind us in this moment in the narrative, but the Valar have invited the Eldar to Valinor, and they're there, and they're all blissfully happy, and then Míriel gives birth to Fëanor, and Finwë ends up sad. So it really makes it as if Míriel's not being strong enough is the fall. It's so bizarre, right? It's like, she, never again shall I bear child, for strength that would have nourished the life of many has gone forth into Fëanor. So she's unhappy, and I would weep if I were not so weary, but hold me blameless in this, and in all that may come after. It's hard not to see it all as her fault, just for being tired after giving birth to the child, and not Finwë saying, why can't you stick around and see his childhood? And Tolkien saying that's the most, the days of child. It goes back, going back here, talking about the days of the children remain in their memory as the most merry in life, and Míriel gets none of that, right? So either, and storytellers paint themselves into corners all the time. It's like, wait, I've created this problem, and now I have to figure out whether there's a logic to it, which could be one of it, right? It's like Tolkien, he knows in his story world there has to be some. You can do this even without like purposing it. It's just like you draft it out and you say, okay, so let's see, Fëanor has half siblings and they quarrel. Okay, that's a good. Wait, how does he have half siblings? They are elves. They don't die, so there's no reason for anybody to end up with half siblings. How can I give them? It's like we obviously you can look back and see all the different drafts, but the earliest drafts seem to already be sort of setting this up, and you are then puzzling over, well, how did I create for myself this problem, and then what kind of problem is it? The obverse of it is you're sort of inspired. The spirit comes and tells you, okay, this, right? And then it is the right choice to make for your story, but you do still have to wrestle out exactly why. And I promise you, when I'm not feeling terrifically inspired in this episode. It's a real wrestle of an episode, but I mean, I'm still missing my dog story from last episode. That you can feel it happening when you're in the sort of compositional moment, and suddenly it's like, I know this is the right thing to have happen, and then only afterwards do you kind of wrestle it out and say, okay, why was that the right thing to happen? What Tolkien ends up with in the laws and customs of the Eldar is, one, this meditation on what Míriel did wrong, if anything, right? She's like, held me blameless. Well, was it her fault? And in that sense, could see Tolkien, as I was suggesting earlier, wrestling with, did Edith not want more children, and he wanted more children, and he didn't know how to deal with that? Is it appropriate for a woman, having given birth to one child that basically nearly kills her, to say, I just can't, I wish I could, but I can't? And is it wrong for the man to go and then look for a wife that can give him more sons? I mean, it could be truly and painfully simply at that level. But then, as a Catholic, Tolkien is in his, I don't think this is Tolkien confessing that he wanted to have affairs. I really don't. Maybe it is. I don't think so. I really. It could be. It's like there, because he did have 3 sons, and then they go on to have Priscilla later, and how much you're writing your own psychodrama into your characters is a challenge, right? Most of the time, most of us put some of our own psychodrama into things, but you can also pick it up from other people. And in prepping for this episode, I was listening to Mel Gibson yelling at his second wife and being angry with her, and I think that's confusing my sympathies, because I can be very sympathetic to the man wanting more children, and I can also be very sympathetic to the woman saying, I just can't. It was too much. That's not what happened with Mel Gibson and his second wife, but that there's some real pain in the center of this laws and customs of the Eldar that Tolkien is wrestling with. And it comes to, which, because I'm tearing up right now, I think I found it. It's always, for me, it's like weep, and then aha, I found the seed that this is growing from. What are we? Are we spirit? Are we body? What is our body in relation to our soul? What is it to say that we are? I mean, over and over and over again in his explanation of what he was trying to understand in making stories, he talks about us as incarnate minds. We remember back in fairy stories, that's the phrase he used. We are incarnate minds, and we tell stories. But he's given us this sadness that the elves basically fade, and their bodies just become less and less substantial, and the days of their bliss, you can see it. The fading is aging, right? You're losing your strength, you're losing your energy, and as you grow older, I can attest, you have less desire for making more children, because, well, you did it, and you're not young anymore, and you have other interests. And you can feel him talking about how they the men and the women diverge in their interests, and it was great when they were having children, but it's okay, we have different interests. Gosh, it's so sad. Now the Eldar are immortal within Arda, according to their right nature. And then he introduces some fancy vocabulary, but of a Fëa, or spirit. Now Fëanor is the core of his imagining about who we are as beings, made in the image and likeness of God, made in the spirit. But if the Fëa, or spirit, indwells and coheres with a hrondo, which becomes hroa, or bodily form, that is not of its own choice but ordained, and is made of the flesh or substance of Arda itself, then the fortune of this union must be vulnerable by the evils that do hurt to Arda, even if that union be by nature and purpose permanent. For in spite of this union, which is of such a kind that according to unmarred nature no living person incarnate may be without a you see why it mattered that I forget how to say that E, nor without a hrondo, yet Fë and hrondo are not the same things, and though the Fëa cannot be broken or disintegrated by any violence from without, the hrondo can be hurt and may be utterly destroyed. If then the hrondo be destroyed or so hurt that it ceases to have health, sooner or later it dies. For some reason in quotes. That is, it becomes painful for the Fëa to dwell in it, being neither a help to life and will nor a delight to use, so that the Fëa departs from it. And its function being at an end, its coherence is unloosed, and it returns again to the general Hron of Arda. Then the Fëa, as it were, houseless, and it becomes invisible to bodily eyes, though clearly perceptible by direct awareness to other fair. This destruction of the Hronda, causing death or the unhousing of the Fëa, was soon experienced by the immortal Eldar, when they awoke in the marred and overshadowed realm of Arda. Indeed, in their earlier days, death came more readily, for their bodies were then less different from the bodies of men, and the command of their spirits over their bodies less complete. This command was nonetheless at all times greater than it has ever been among men. From their beginnings, the chief difference between elves and men lay in the fate and nature of their spirits. Aha! It's like the difference between elves and men has to do with our Fëa. Fëar, plural with the R. The Fëar of the elves were destined to dwell in Arda for all the life of Arda, and the death of the flesh did not abrogate their destiny. Their Fëar were tenacious, therefore, of life and the raiment of Arda, and far excelled the spirits of men in power over that raiment, even from the first days, protecting their bodies from any ills and assaults, such as disease, and healing them swiftly of injuries, so that they recovered from wounds that would have proved fatal to men. Like the power of their spirit keeps them from succumbing to disease or injury. As ages passed, the dominance of their Fëar ever increased, consuming their bodies, as has been noted. The end of this process is their fading, as men have called it, for the body becomes at last, as it were, a mere memory held by the Fëa, and that end has already been achieved in many regions of Middle-earth. So the elves are indeed deathless and may not be destroyed or changed. Thus it is that the further we go back in the histories, the more often do we read of the death of the elves of old. He's backpedaling also in his story. It's like, how did I kill them all off? Oh, right. Wait, they're immortal. Okay, they were easier to kill in the past because their bodies were still more like men's bodies, but now their Fëar are, more tenacious over their... Wait. And in the days when the minds of the Eldalia were young and not yet fully awake, death among them seemed to differ little from the death of men. What then happened to the houseless Fëa? The answer to this question the elves did not know by nature. In their beginning, so they report, they believed or guessed that they entered into nothing, and ended like other living things that they knew, even as a tree that was felled and burned. Others guessed more darkly that they passed into the realm of night and into the power of the Lord of Night. These opinions were plainly derived from the shadow under which they awoke, and it was to deliver them from this shadow upon their minds, more even than from the dangers of Ardamard, that the Valar desired to bring them to the light of Aman. It was in Aman that they learned of Manwë that each Fëa was imperishable within the life of Arda, and that its fate was to inhabit Arda to its end. Those Fëar, therefore, that in the marring of Arda suffered unnaturally a divorce from their Hrondar, remained still in Arda and in time, but in this state they were open to direct instruction and command of the Valar. As soon as they were disbodied, they were summoned to leave the places of their life and death and go to the halls of waiting, Mandos, in the realm of the Valar. If they obeyed this summons, different opportunities lay before them. The length of time that they dwelt in waiting was partly at the will of Namo, the judge, Lord of Mandos, partly at their own will. The happiest fortune they deemed was after the waiting to be reborn, for so the evil and grief that they had suffered in the curtailment of their natural course might be redressed. Well, good grief, yet again, cake and eat it too. And you can see how his story world created theological problems for him. Did the Eldar know that their proper fate within Arda was to be reincarnated, and that they only learn it when they're in Valinor? And then indeed with this, there's story reasons for this, to say the things like, is Arwen Luthien reborn? And we think no, but the elves know that character, the same Fëa can come back in a different body. It doesn't seem to happen that often, actually, but the premise or the promise. We have our cat today. Is that they can be rehoused, right? But most of the time, I mean, it's like Finwë. Well, okay, I've leapt ahead. Finwë does indeed get killed in the early stories, and ends up in Lórien and is able to meet Míriel, and they have a little conversation about her decision while he was still alive. But it's interesting with Tolkien trying to say their body and soul, and then figuring out exactly what kind of housing, this sort of idea that the spirit needs a house and longs for a house, and yet doesn't depend on the house for being the individual. This is Tolkien's version of the question of whether elves have souls, as Vox Day explored in his Selenoth stories of Summa Helvetica. In Summa Helvetica, the premise is, to start with, the elves don't have souls, because within Christian theology, what happens to the soul is it goes somewhere else, right? And in Tolkienian, elvish theology, well, they go to the halls of Mandos, which is still within Arda. So are they dead? Are they alive? Exactly what sort of relationship do they have to creation if they never, in fact, leave it? Interesting that, as the reason given in this text that the Valar wanted to bring the elves to Valinor, to bring them to the light of Aman, was not the dangers that they were caught up in Ardamard, right? Morgoth is out there making earthquakes and volcanoes and floods and things like that. And the Valar are telling themselves, no. The reason that we wanted the Eldar to come to Valinor was because they didn't understand what happened to their Fëa if their Hroar were damaged. Okay. The Valar bring them to the light of Aman specifically to teach them about life after death. Okay, fine. Right, but that's clearly what Tolkien wants to achieve, and he also wants to, have some sort of, it's like, you think Aquinas gets convoluted, right? Some understanding of the relationship between the body and soul and the person, right? And then also, which becomes more, it's like, what happens, right? If you set yourself up with a reincarnation question, then you set yourself up with what happens when the Fëa is reborn? Is it rehoused? And that he has this language of housing is very interesting, because you would say there's a kind of potential Christian element behind that in the sense that our bodies are temples of the Holy Spirit, but that's not what he's doing, right? He's saying the Hroar are a house where the Fëar dwell, and yet the Fëar are unhappy, as it were, without a Hroar, but the Hroar are also distinct. Well, you see that he created this problem with Míriel because her Hroa never decayed, right? It stayed. She didn't get. She wasn't technically fully dead because although her spirit had left her body was still just there, apparently asleep. So she wasn't really dead, and she wasn't really alive. And Finwë wants to get remarried and have more children, right? Tolkien also started wondering, which I think we've now gone into, even more layers than maybe I can unpack here. He also started worrying about what sort of where the Fëa comes from, and that Míriel is exhausted in nourishing Fëanor. Why should it, be so hard on her? Some of it is because he says, now I've lost my place where I was going to. The Fëa are nourished by both parents, is what I'm looking for, and that is. So they say the new Fëa, and therefore in their beginning all Fëar, they believe to come direct from Eru, and from beyond Ea, right? And so, again, their marriage involves sex and the name, so it's both the bodily joining and the invocation of Eru, and that somehow these Fëar come from Eru outside of Arda. Therefore, many of them hold that it cannot be asserted that the fate of the elves is to be confined within Arda forever and with it to cease. This last opinion they draw from their own thought, for the Valar, having had no part in the devising of the children of Eru, do not know fully the purposes. So even the Valar don't really know. But the main thing that they think of is that some of what the new Fëar get comes from their parents, right? For all of the Eldar, being aware of it in themselves, spoke of the passing of much strength, both of mind and of body, into their children in bearing and begetting. Therefore, they hold that the Fëa, though unbegotten, draws nourishment from the parents before the birth of the child, directly from the Fëa of the mother, while she bears and nourishes the Rondo, immediately but equally from the father, whose Fëa is bound in union with the mother's and supports it. Now that, I think, is potentially the most fascinating claim that Tolkien is making here, and it's bearing directly on what he's imagined happened to Míriel in giving birth to Fëanor, that she said, I'm nourishing him, but it's his spirit, not just her body, right? It's not that she was worn out by childbearing physically. It's that her spirit in nourishing his spirit was overwhelmed. And Tolkien claims through this, that his Laws and Customs, that equally the father also contributes a spirit to the child's spirit. Okay, so we then have the problem of what marriage is and whether Míriel could be held blameless. Right, so there are questions about the reincarnation, if marriage resides ultimately in the will of the Fëar. Also, the identity of a person resides wholly in the Fëa, and the reborn is the same person as the one who died. Who is it, right? And that she doesn't have a new body, but her Fëa still exists. Okay. The body, because Míriel's body didn't decay, then Tolkien has created himself this very fascinating question, and has to invoke, in the second part of the work, an entire council of the Eldar to figure out whether Finwë can appropriately get remarried. And there's a big debate, right? So we have a debate about who's at fault, whether it's appropriate for Finwë to remarry, and who actually can judge, right? Now, it's convened by Manwë, and I imagine the court of the Valar sitting there, and he advises them. The tension is interesting, is between healing and justice. Not interesting. It's not mercy and justice. Tolkien sets it up as between healing and justice, and the problem, as Mondo sets it up, is that we live in Ardamard, right? And that's where I think it's like, okay, one, I seem to, whenever, as I'm talking this one through, whenever I get to a thing that seems to be about Tolkien wrestling with something that he in his own life had to wrestle with, it feels more real. When it's up at this abstract level of, oh, well, and if Arda is marred, and does that mean that the elves too are going to experience suffering and no marriage is going to be happy? And well, why wouldn't, why do you have Arda marred in the first place? Oh, well, that's just driving the story. That seems sort of fictional and fictive in the sense of artificial, and surely, this is a problem just created by the need for, I don't know, right? And then you realize all of our stories are always coming out of the unresolved tensions that we just experience in our own lives, one of which is, are we body or are we soul? Which is it? Are we mostly the experiences that we have while we're alive and incarnate? Are we most real after death with our spirits? I mean, within the Christian theology that the men are going to have to wrestle with, we expect to rise again in bodies. So it's like I compared Míriel under the tree in her incorrupt body to saints, the bodies of the saints, which we revere as Catholics because we see them as participating ultimately in the resurrection, right? It's like it's worth putting them in the fancy coffins and the crystal boxes, because they will actually rise again. They're not just dead matter. They're not simply return to the marred material of Arda. They will rise again and be reanimate by the souls, the spirits, the souls of the individuals that they originally belonged to. Now, medieval theologians were actually more sophisticated in that. They didn't think that exactly that body needed, and they'd had long discussions about exactly which matter God needed to have in order to rehouse your, they didn't say rehouse the body to, but they did have these problems of trying to explain, is the body like a statue that's broken up and you can put it back together, or is it matter that you just kind of swirl, reverse the Thanos dissolving and bring it all back together, and you were there. That we are in our own lives obviously wrestling with this feeling of, why are we living in a world that's so broken? Why is it filled with sorrow? Why do people die, which is the ordinary and profound question, but these tangles of dilemmas that we get caught in, which obviously I keep coming back to, that I can feel that Tolkien's wrestling with something about. Míriel didn't want to have more children, and she was just tired, and he wanted to have more children. Finwë wanted to have more children, and he did it. And was that wrong? Right. Well, within the imagined world, Manwë speaks to the Valar, saying, "In this matter you must not forget that you deal with Ardamard, out of which ye brought the Eldar." Right? You are to a certain extent at fault here for bringing them to Valinor in the first place. They could have just, been in Arda where they woke up. We brought them here. We tried to interfere, right? That's, to me, that's very interesting. The Valar, it's like, where's the fall in Tolkien's story? And I'm about to see, it's like, Míriel kind of part of it. Is she blameless? Is she Eve here? Like Eve under the tree? Right, for not wanting to have more children. Mando's reminding the Valar that they brought the elves to, they brought the Eldar to Valinor, and they've like interfered with the whole thing. Neither must ye forget that in Ardamar justice is not healing. Okay, now it's at a very powerful level, right? It's like they want to make the right decision because the Eldar are not supposed to remarry if the original spouse is still alive, and Míriel's body is still incorrupt. Okay. Healing cometh only by suffering and patience, and maketh no demand, not even for justice. Justice worketh only within the bounds of things as they are, excepting the marring of Arda. And therefore, though justice is itself good and desireth no further evil, it can but perpetuate the evil that was, and doth not prevent it from the bearing of fruit in sorrow. Thus the statute was just, but it accepted death and the severance of Finwë and Míriel, a thing unnatural in Arda unmarred. And therefore, with reference to Arda unmarred, it was unnatural and fraught with death. If they were in Arda unmarred, Finwë and Míriel should never have been separated. But because we're in Arda marred, because we're in the fallen world, is this simply so banal as arguing for dispensation within our sinful world? The liberty that it gave was a lower road that, if it led not still downwards, could not again ascend. But healing must retain ever the thought of Arda unmarred, and if it cannot ascend, must abide in patience. This is hope, which I deem is there before all else the virtue most fair in the children of Eru, but cannot be commanded to come when needed. Patience must often long await it. Now that is a remarkable speech, because if you pay attention in the Lord of the Rings, you remember they're always proceeding without hope. That they do what they feel they need to do, think they need to do, think. They do what they judge they need to do, and Aragorn says this frequently. We go into this without hope, right? And here Mondos is saying there is hope is the virtue that's most fair in all the children of Eru, and so to allow Finwë to remarry, although it was against justice in Arda unmarred, because in Arda unmarred they would have never been separated. In Arda marred, hope is the great virtue. Now it's very interesting the way then the Valar who weigh in argue. Alla makes a very interesting suggestion that, it's like, was it the making that was at fault? That he's saying the I don't want to have to read all of this out, but it's also dense. This is about 5 pages, and I'm not gonna read all that out. But Alla's argument is saying, the birth took it out of Míriel. What then of the cost of the birth? Must it not be thought that the greatness and the cost come not from Arda marred or unmarred, from beyond Arda? So maybe the making was just too big, right? And that Alla is saying, Alla spake, being unwilling to believe that any taint of the shadow lay upon Fëanor, and he had been, of course, most eager to summon the Noldor to Valinor, right? So he's saying there's nothing wrong here. Alla is trying to say maybe it's just the making was so big, and Fëanor is worth it. Not worth it. The making was so big, there's no fault here, right? But Ulmo answered, nonetheless, Míriel died. And is not death for the Eldar an evil? That is a thing unnatural in Arda unmarred, which must proceed therefore from marriage. The death of Míriel has brought sorrow to Amun, and what's interesting, the coming of Fëanor must proceed certainly from the will of Eru, as Alla had argued. Maybe all of this is happening outside of Arda. Maybe this is coming from the will of Eru. It is interesting how in these early stories, or in this, these are early in the sense of before obviously the First Age, but that Tolkien is still trying to have some place for the will of the creator, Eru, in their deliberations about the choices that they're making. It's less obvious. It's less obvious in things like the Lord of the Rings, whether they're choosing to go with Eru, right? Thy will be done, whether that's the Father's will. But here the Valar are debating, was Míriel's death necessary to the will of Eru? And Ulmo says, well, but I hold that the marring of his birth comes of the shadow, and is a portent of evils to come, for the greatest or the most potent also for evil. Ulmo, so Aula had argued that they should bring the Eldar to Valinor, right? Remember, this is all set up. The whole problem is because Míriel has simply fallen asleep and is in Valinor, and now Finwë is sorrowful in the Blessed Realm. He's the only one sorrowful in the Blessed Realm, and that the elves are there at all is because the Valar brought them there. There's just these great cascades of potential responsibility, which is why Moundos has to get them to talk about what they did. Ulmo had, was with great love for the elves and also men, but he thinks they should have just been left where they were in Arda. The gods in effect shouldn't have interfered, and now great evil is coming. Then Ivana spoke, and she agrees. She tends to agree more with Ulmo. She says, particularly the problem being that the children are not as we, but both spirit and body. And the body is of Arda, and by Arda was nourished. That maybe they were better off when they were actually where they were meant to be in the physical realm. So that the shadow worketh not only upon spirits, but has marred the very throne of Arda, and all Middle Earth is perverted by the evil of Melkor, who has wrought in it as mightily as any one among us here. Therefore none of those who woke in Middle Earth, and there dwelt before they came hither, have come here wholly free. They're still caught up in the physical. And Yavanna is saying, the failing of the strength of the body of Míriel may then be ascribed with some reason to the evil of Arda Mard, and her death be a thing unnatural. And therefore we should heed this. So she dies because she's physically weak. We have, it's an interesting range of options that the Valar are coming up with. That always saying, well, maybe it wasn't actually a bad thing because Fëanor is worth the expense, and possibly Eru means it, and almost says no, we should have left them alone. And Yavanna says yes, maybe the body is so weak because they don't belong here in Valinor. Then Nienna spoke, and her argument is, why are you blaming them? In the use of justice there must be pity, which is the consideration of the singleness of each that cometh under justice. Which of you, Valar, in your wisdom, will blame these children, Finwë and Míriel? For the children are both strong and without might. Mandos you hold to be the strongest of all that are in Arda, being the least moved, and therefore you have dared to commit even the martyr himself to his keeping. Yet I say to you that each of the Fëa of the children is as strong as he. For it has the strength of its singleness impregnable, which cometh to it from Aru as to us, and its nakedness that is obdurate beyond all power that ye have to move it if it will not. Yet the children are not mighty in life, they are little, and can effect little, and they are young, and they know time only. Their minds are as the hands of their babies, little in grasp, and even as that grasp unfilled. And that she says, I think this is Nienna who mourns, right? And she's saying, I think Míriel died by necessity of body and suffering for which she was blameless, or indeed to be praised, and yet was not given power to resist it, the cost of so great a childbearing. And herein I think that Allah perceived a part of the truth. The severance of the Fëa was in Míriel a thing special. Death is indeed death, and within the great theme cometh from the martyr and is grievous, but Eru in this death had a purpose of immediate good, and it need not have borne any bitter fruit, whereas death that comes from the martyr only is intended for evil, and its healing must await in hope only, even as the end. But Finwë, not understanding death, cried out, is there not healing in Aman? So it's interesting, the choices seem to, is this the will of God, is this the will of Eru that Míriel should die and Finwë doesn't understand it, or is it that we erred as Valar in bringing them here, as Ulmo and Yavanna are suggesting, because they're part of Arda, right? They belong in the physical, and that they're too weak to deal with this. Well, Ulmo says, herein I perceive not only the direct will of Eru, but fault in his creatures. Not guilt, yet a failing from the highest, which is the hope of which the king has spoken. It was her fault, because she gave up hope, right? And it's like, well, that's quite powerful. That she abandoned her own life. She basically commits suicide, is the problem. But also deserted her spouse and marred his life. The union is a marriage is not ended having further purpose. For one thing, Fëanor would be deprived of his mother's part in his nurture. Now, that's coming on amazingly strong. She failed in hope. That Mondos has said, hope is before all else the virtue most fair in the children of Eru, and almost saying, yes, she failed. She quit and gave up. Thus, Ulmo argues, Finwë was aggrieved and claimed justice. But when he called her and she did not return, and only a few years, he fell into despair. Herein lay his fault in failing in hope. But also he founded his claim mainly upon his desire for children, considering his own self and his loss more than the griefs that had befallen his wife. That was a failing in full love. So Ulmo, who is the sea, right? He, Mondos the breath, right? Ulmo the sea, Yavanna the growing things. Ulmo says they both gave up. The Míriel abandoned hope. Finwë abandoned hope. He was thinking only of himself and his desire for more children, and he failed in love for her, in that he didn't appreciate what it was for her to have given forth all of that. So the fare of the Eldar, he says, cannot be broken or forced, and the motion of their will cannot therefore be predicted with certainty. Yet it seemeth to me that there was hope, that after repose in Mondos the Fae of Míriel should return of itself to its nature, which is to desire to inhabit a body. And because Finwë, Ulmo argues, was so impatient, the greater fault is his, because he will close the door of life to his wife to return, because once he's remarried, if she returns, it becomes all impossible. Well, now Valar, who is the one with whom she is how to describe her best, the weaver, the wife of Mondos, the one with whom Míriel is actually housed, as it were. Her Fëa is there. She says, no. You realize we're at the level of Star Wars fanfic by Tolkien writing his own fanfic, right? The characters themselves debating the degree to which his own characters are at fault or not, right? And giving the sort of court of Mondos, the court of Manwë. What have I done to myself? The court of Mondos. Manwë spoke, right? Manwë spoke, and now the other Valar, and then Valar, who is the wife of Mondos, all these Valars, right? Is saying, no, Míriel is with me, and she's strong. Her Fëa is with me, I know it well, for it is small, but it is strong, proud, and obdurate. It is of that sort who, having said, this I will do, make their words a doom irrevocable unto themselves. So Valar responds to Ulmo, no, she's strong, and that she will not to return to life or to Finwë, even if he waited until the aging of the world. So whereas Ulmo is claiming that Finwë gave up hope, Valar is saying no, Míriel is obdurate and proud. It's not about hope, it's that she's not going to give up. And also Valar goes on to say, we can't know the mystery necessarily, but if we are to speak of justice, then Finwë's belief must be taken into account. And if as I judge, it is well founded, not a fantasy of his own inconstancy, but against his will and desire, we must otherwise assess the faults of these two. Well, how would you decide if you were Manwë? Well, they sit long in silence, and he says, "There's reason and wisdom in all that you say. Truly in the matter of the children we approach mysteries, and the key to their full understanding was not given to us. In part, the children are indeed one, or maybe the chief of those new things of which Allah has spoken. Yet they came into Ardamard and were destined to do so, to endure the marring, even though they came in their beginning from beyond Ea." We may say, therefore, that the elves are destined to know death in their mode, being sent into a world which contains death and having a form for which death is possible. You realize the story problem that he's created for himself is he does kill them off every so often. Tolkien kills the elves off every so often dramatically. And Manwë is now saying, well, they came from beyond Arda, but they're in it now, and therefore death has to be a possibility. And there may be two different understandings of death. Allah niena idim, says Mandos, for what each saith in different words meaneth this much, that death which cometh from the marrer may be one thing, and death as an instrument of Eru be another thing, and discernible, the one being of malice, and therefore only evil and inevitably grievous, the other being of benevolence, intending particular and immediate good. For the evil and the grief of death are in the mere severance of breach of nature, which is alike in both, and both occur only in Ardamard, therefore, in accord with its process. Therefore I deem that Ulmo is to be followed rather, holding that Eru need not and would not desire as a special instruments of his benevolence a thing that is evil. Nonetheless, Eru is Lord of all, and will use as instruments of his final purposes which are good, whatsoever any of his creatures, great or small, do or devise. Okay. Unpack to say death is here, it's part of Ardamard. It can be both a evil thing and a good thing, both, something that comes from the marring of Arda, but it can also be something that Eru intends. However, Eru need not and would not desire as a special instrument of his benevolence a thing that is evil. For Arda Arnmard hath two aspects or senses. The first is the unmarred that they discern in the marred, if their eyes are not dimmed and yearn for, as we yearn for the will of Eru. There it is, flat out. The will of God is the focus of the mystery for Manwë. This is the ground upon which hope is built. Hope is built on the ground of yearning for the will of God. The second is the unmarred that shall be, that is to speak according to time in which they have their being, the Arda healed, which shall be greater and more fair than the first because of the marring. This is the hope that sustaineth. It cometh not only from the yearning for the will of Iluvatar, the begetter, which by itself may lead those within time to no more than regret, but also from trust in Eru, the Lord everlasting, that he is good, and that his works shall all end in good. This the marrer hath denied, and in this denial is the root of evil, and its end is in despair. Therefore, notwithstanding the words of Ira, I abide by that which I said first. And it concludes that the Valar must not and must not presume certainty with regard to the wills of the children, nor even were they certain in this one case concerning the Fae of Míriel, would that unmake the union of love that was once between her and her spouse, or render void the judgment that constancy to it would in Finwë be a better and fairer course, more in accord with Arda Anmard, or with the will of Eru in permitting this thing to befall him. And what he ended up with was saying that it was appropriate for Finwë to remarry, and then Mondo spoke and said, well, okay, we counsel the children, and we have to deal with them within Ardamard, but we don't know everything. Now, you could say, yet again, Tolkien's kind of punted, but I think he's trying to give, at least himself in his own meditation on the dilemma that he's created for his characters, some theological grounding, and saying that this is what tests us. This is, in fact, the kind of test that we're given over and over and over again in life, and staying, grounding ourselves on the will of God, grounding ourselves on the will of Eru, is where hope is built. We live in Ardamard, but we're sustained with this, whatever hope is. The Marr has denied that the works of the Lord everlasting are good, and that's where despair comes in. Well, after Finwë dies, he shows up and has a little conversation with Míriel. She says, "Whoops, I was wrong," which is fascinating, right? That and what happens in the end is her fury is released. She goes back to her body. Her body wakes up, and rather than returning to Arda, she ends up spending her time in Vaira. Remember, Vaira is when she's really proud and she's really strong and she knows what she's doing. That Míriel, in the long run, ends up in Vaira's household weaving, right? Míriel was accepted by Vaira and became her chief handmaid, and all tidings of the Noldor down the years from their beginning were brought to her, and she wove them in webs historial, so fair and skilled that they seem to live imperishable, shining with a light of many hues, fairer than are known Middle Earth. This labor Finwë is at times permitted to look upon, and still she is at work, though her name has been changed, for now she is named Furiel, to which the Eldar signifies she that died, and also she that sighed. As fair as the webs of Furiel is praise that is given seldom even to the works of the Eldar. Clearly, Tolkien made for himself yet another of his unanswerables, right? And trying to understand, it's like the making of Fëanor, the making of this child who becomes the greatest craftsman ever in his stories, because Fëanor makes the Silmarils, and whose attachment to the things he made, to the Silmarils, will become the curse that drives, the whole drama of the First Age, but also it's the example of the curse that will carry through all of Tolkien's stories. When you become so attached to your making, to your making in particular. I was thinking Gollum and the Precious, right? He becomes attached to this made thing, but Fëanor, the doom that Fëanor is going to end up living out is to become so attached to the crystals that he fills with this fire, right? It's like, so Fëanor is himself an image of the Silmarils, because his Fia, his spirit, is housed in this physical body, like he housed the light in the crystals of the Silmarils, right? That he is Fëanor himself is the greatest gemstone that is made in all of Arda, in Valinor, in Arda. And so his marring is going to be even more grievous a destruction than the Silmarils end up, they're destroyed or thrown into the sea, kept in the earth, carried in the sky. But Fëanor's marring is going to be even more grievous. And to say that in his making, his mother, whether there's a question of whether she can be blameless, whether the Valar can be blameless for bringing the Eldar to Valinor in the first place, whether it was right, as Aule tries to argue, that, well, this bad thing happened, but it's actually a good thing that Eru intended, and almost saying, no, you can't say that something that's so evil as this marring could be willed by Eru. Ivana saying, well, it's all within the marring. Nienna saying, well, they're weak, and yet their spirits are like ours. Almost there's the judgment that Manwë gives on whether Finwë can remarry, but the feeling that we're left, this scribbling over and over and over again, fate of immortal elves to inhabit New Arda. Over and over, to contemplate the tale of Arda, the blessed must in spirit a whole being leave the time of Arda. Tolkien gave his elvish characters no possibility of true contemplation because they'd already seen the light of the trees, and that was the best he could give them. And so their longing, interestingly, is always bounded by Arda, and the Valar had already brought them into the light of Aman, and yet great sorrow came with that invitation. This, my friends, is what happens when, unbeknownst to, I don't know, unbeknownst to your own purposes, you start writing stories and you realize that you've created dilemmas for the characters that have far deeper implications than maybe you intended. I mean, really, all Tolkien wanted to do at the beginning was write stories about traveling in the perilous realm and talking to elves. And he ends up with the challenge of understanding whether or not the greatest, the evils that come with our positive desires for things like children and love go against the actual will of God. It's pretty heavy going. And it only gets deeper. Thank you for joining me. To be continued.